Picture this. You step blindly into a freezing whiteout. The order barks over the howling wind. Step forward, shoot once, step back. You loose a single arrow into the blinding snow and duck. 3 seconds later, the sky screams. 500,000 arrows slam into the earth exactly where you just stood. The enemy took the bait, emptying their entire arsenal into thin air. You stand up, rip their arrows from the frozen mud, and fire them right back. Welcome to the Battle of Towton, 1461. While chivalric myths paint medieval warfare as honourable duels, this was an industrial-scale slaughter engineered by a single aerodynamic trick. What happens when extreme weather, weaponised deception, and political hatred ignite the bloodiest battle in English history? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The date is March 29th, 1461, Palm Sunday. A massive blizzard is burying a desolate Yorkshire plateau. Over 80,000 men are freezing to death in the snow. This isn't a skirmish, it is a demographic catastrophe. Nearly 10% of all able-bodied men in England are standing in this icy hell, forced into a dynastic gang war known as the Wars of the Roses. On one side, the House of Lancaster defends King Henry VI. He is completely broken, paralysed by severe mental illness, hiding miles behind the lines while his lords direct the carnage. Facing him is the House of York, commanded by an 18-year-old warlord. King Edward IV is a 6'4" giant. He doesn't sit in a command tent. He wades directly into the snowdrifts, sword in hand, fighting shoulder to shoulder with his starving infantry. Edward knows the brutal mathematics of this winter standoff. Nobody has enough food. Dysentery is tearing through the camps. His army will disintegrate in days if they don't fight right now. The phantom volley you just survived was a desperate gamble to force a close-quarters brawl. The Lancastrian quivers are empty. The blinding snow is blowing violently into their faces. There is no ransom today, no noble prisoners. Edward has ordered his men to slaughter everyone. As the two massive steel lines finally collide in the whiteout, the real horror begins. Before the steel clashed at Towton, the battle was already being decided by the sheer physical and psychological contrast between the two men claiming the English throne. The Wars of the Roses is often romanticised as a complex game of chess between noble houses, but by March 1461, it had degenerated into a brutal gang war for survival. The men freezing in the snow did not care about distant royal lineages. They cared about who was leading them into the meat grinder. On the Lancastrian side, the supposed leader of the realm was King Henry VI. But Henry was not on the battlefield. He was miles away in the city of York, trembling in a church, completely incapacitated by what modern psychiatrists suspect was catatonic schizophrenia. He was a man who shuddered at the sight of drawn swords and was reportedly terrified of loud noises. His army of 40,000 men was being commanded by a committee of lords who knew their king was essentially a hollow vessel. Standing against this ghost of a king was the Yorkist challenger, Edward IV. At just 18 years old, Edward was a terrifying physical specimen. Historical records and the surviving dimensions of his armour indicate he stood at a towering 6 feet 4 inches, weighing over 240 pounds. The Milanese ambassador, observing the young warlord, famously reported back to his masters, "He's a man so vigorous and handsome that he might have been made to the order of a king." But Edward did not just look the part. He acted it in the most brutal way possible. Instead of directing his forces from a safe vanguard on horseback, Edward dismounted. He waded into the freezing snow, hefting a heavy poleaxe, and positioned himself directly in the frontline infantry block. This single act electrified the Yorkist army. Here was a king willing to bleed and die in the mud with his starving soldiers, and starvation was the true enemy that morning. Gathering 80,000 men in the desolate frozen expanse of Yorkshire was a logistical nightmare. Supply lines had completely shattered. For days, the soldiers on both sides had been surviving on scavenged roots, rotting rations and freezing mud water. Dysentery was ripping through the camps. Edward knew that if he did not force a decisive battle immediately, his army would dissolve into a mob of dying men. He didn't just want a victory. He needed to annihilate the Lancastrian leadership to secure his crown. The phantom volley had stripped the enemy of their arrows, but the real test was about to begin. The snow was falling thicker now, masking the screams of the dying, as Edward raised his weapon and ordered the advance. Wars are rarely won by swords alone. They are won by bread, boots, and coin. Bringing 80,000 men to a desolate plateau in Yorkshire during late March was an act of absolute economic suicide. Edward IV had literally mortgaged his life to get to this snowy field. To fund his rapid northern campaign, the young king borrowed over £4,000 from the merchants of London. That was an astronomical sum in 1461, enough to bankrupt the city's economy if he failed to take the throne. This was the ultimate all-in gamble. The Yorkists had marched nearly 200 miles north through freezing rain, dragging their heavy armour and weapons through knee-deep mud just to catch the royal army. By the time both forces converged at Towton, the logistical networks had completely collapsed. You simply cannot feed 10% of England's male population in a frozen agricultural wasteland. Foraging was impossible because the locals had already fled, stripping the land of livestock and grain. The soldiers were surviving on rotting provisions, chewing on roots, and drinking from freezing, mud-choked streams. Then came the invisible killer. Dysentery began tearing through the encampments. Men were bleeding out from their bowels before a single sword was swung. Imagine standing in a blizzard, weighed down by 30 pounds of steel, while your own body shuts down from severe dehydration and starvation. Steel breastplates and chainmail act like wearable refrigerators in sub-zero temperatures, violently pulling the core heat out of a malnourished body. It honestly makes you wonder how any of these men had the strength to even stand upright, let alone swing a weapon for 10 hours. The Lancastrians were in no better shape. Despite being closer to friendly northern territory, gathering 40,000 men in one spot stripped the local environment bare like a plague of locusts. As military historian Christopher Gravitt notes regarding the grim reality of this campaign, neither army could afford a prolonged standoff. Starvation and disease would have destroyed them both within a week. They had to fight today. There was no retreating because there was absolutely no food left along the road back south. There was no delaying, as every passing hour meant more soldiers collapsing into the snow never to wake up. Edward knew this better than anyone. He understood that a desperate, starving man fights with a terrifying kind of ferocity. In those final moments before the charge, those men were no longer fighting for chivalric honour or complex dynastic claims. They were fighting to butcher the enemy and loot their camp for a crust of bread. The brutal weather of Palm Sunday wasn't just a dramatic backdrop. It was the biological catalyst that forced this meat grinder into motion. The morning of March 29th broke with a surreal and deceptive silence. It was Palm Sunday, a day the medieval Christian world dedicated to peace, charity, and the memory of Christ's triumphant entry into Jerusalem. But God, it seemed, had entirely abandoned Yorkshire. Instead of spring sunshine, a freak weather system slammed into the plateau, unleashing a blinding horizontal blizzard. Imagine the absolute sensory deprivation. The wind howled so violently that it drowned out the war horns and the screaming commands of the captains. You could barely see the man standing shoulder to shoulder with you, let alone the enemy lines forming just a few hundred yards away. The temperature plummeted well below freezing, and nature itself became a mutual, indiscriminate killer. For the archers, this weather was a physical torture that modern reenactors still shudder to think about. Hemp bowstrings, when exposed to freezing moisture, contract and snap. To keep their weapons functional, archers had to string their heavy yew bows with fingers that were rapidly succumbing to frostbite. Drawing back a warbow requires over 100 pounds of pulling force. Now imagine doing that when the skin of your fingertips is practically frozen to the bowstring, blood smeared across the wood with every volley. But the Yorkists had one massive, undeniable advantage, And this is where the ruthless genius of their frontline commander, Lord Falkenberg, came into play. The wind was howling from the south, blowing directly into the faces of the Lancastrian army. It was a relentless barrage of ice crystals that forced the royal troops to squint or completely shut their eyes just to avoid being blinded. As the contemporary writer of the Croyland Chronicle noted with eerie precision, the snow blew very heavily into the faces of the Lancastrians so that their sight was almost completely cut off. Falkenberg realised that this wind wasn't just an annoyance, it was a weapon of mass destruction. A strong tailwind doesn't just push an arrow faster, it carries it significantly further than its standard maximum range. This was the exact condition that made the phantom volley possible. When Falkenberg commanded his vanguard to step forward into the blinding whiteout, they didn't aim. They didn't need to. They angled their bows high, let the gale force winds catch their lightweight flight arrows, and sent a lethal rain down onto an enemy they couldn't even see. The Lancastrians felt the sting of steel falling from the sky. Blinded by the snow, panicked, and assuming the Yorkists were advancing, they unleashed their own massive volley in retaliation. But they were firing into a severe headwind. Their arrows stalled in the freezing air, dropping harmlessly into the snowdrifts 40 yards short of the Yorkist lines. For several terrifying minutes, the Lancastrians emptied their quivers, firing hundreds of thousands of arrows into absolute nothingness. They had just thrown away their greatest tactical asset. The long-range war was over. The close-quarters butchery was about to begin. With their quivers completely empty, the Lancastrian commanders realised their catastrophic mistake. They had only one suicidal option left. They had to abandon their defensive position and march blindly into the storm to force a hand-to-hand engagement. Imagine being a Lancastrian infantryman at that exact moment. You're already exhausted, starving and freezing. Now you must trudge uphill against gale-force winds through ankle-deep snow, weighed down by heavy armour. By the time the Royal Army actually reached the Yorkist lines, thousands of men were already hyperventilating, their muscles burning from lactic acid build-up before a single blow was even struck. When the two massive formations finally collided, the nature of medieval warfare changed from a tactical manoeuvre into an industrial slaughterhouse. Forget the elegant sword fights you see in Hollywood movies. A standard broadsword is practically useless against 15th century plate armour. Slashing at solid steel only ruins the blade. To kill a fully armoured man at Towton, you needed to deliver massive kinetic energy to shatter the bones and rupture the organs beneath the armour without necessarily piercing the steel itself. This brutal necessity made the poleaxe the undisputed king of the winter battlefield. It was a vicious, 5-foot-long weapon featuring a hammerhead for crushing chests, a spike for thrusting through eye slits, and an axe blade for hooking and dragging a man down. Wielding one required tremendous upper body strength. As modern osteoarchaeologists examining the Towton dead have grimly noted in their forensic reports, the sheer ferocity of the blunt force trauma indicates men were repeatedly bludgeoned with incredible violence long after they had fallen. The physical toll of swinging a heavy wooden and steel weapon in a densely packed crush of humanity is staggering. The combatants were pressed together so tightly that drawing a secondary weapon like a dagger became impossible. It is horrifying to realise that the greatest danger wasn't always the enemy swinging an axe in front of you, but the crushing pressure of your own army behind you. The noise alone would have been maddening. A deafening roar of splintering wood, screaming men, and steel slamming into steel, all muffled by the relentless howling of the blizzard. Men were crushed to death by the sheer weight of the crowd shifting back and forth. You didn't need to be struck by a weapon to die here. If you slipped on the bloody snow and fell, you were instantly trampled into the freezing mud by the iron-shod boots of your own comrades. Blood began to mix with the heavy snowfall, turning the battlefield into a slick crimson sludge that sucked at the men's boots. The phantom volley had started the killing, but this grinding, suffocating melee would lock 80,000 men in a death embrace for the next 10 hours. Swinging a 5-pound piece of steel and wood for 10 minutes is exhausting. Doing it for 10 continuous hours in freezing temperatures borders on a biological impossibility. Yet the men at Towton hacked at each other from late morning until dusk, without a single pause. I always find it baffling when military textbooks map out neat, orderly troop formations for medieval engagements. Towton was not an elegant game of chess. It was a suffocating, hyper-violent mosh pit. As the butchery ground on, a horrifying phenomenon began to reshape the battlefield itself. Men were dying in such tightly packed ranks that their bodies simply had nowhere to fall. The dead piled up, interlocked with the dying, creating a massive, fleshy barricade between the two armies. The chroniclers of the time were utterly traumatized by this sight. As the Tudor historian Polydore Virgil later recorded from eyewitness accounts, the dead were so many that the living were forced to climb over the heaps of bodies to come at the enemy. Try to wrap your mind around that level of psychological horror. You are exhausted, desperately thirsty, and your boots are sinking into a thick sludge of red snow. To survive, you must literally step on the faces and crushed chests of your dead friends, using their corpses as stepping stones to swing your axe at a Lancastrian soldier doing the exact same thing on the other side. The stamina required to maintain this level of violence defies modern understanding of human endurance. Calories were burning at an astronomical rate in severely malnourished bodies. Men were collapsing from heart failure and sheer physical exhaustion long before a blade ever touched them. How did the Yorkist line hold against a numerically superior royal army under these impossible conditions? The answer lies directly in the towering figure of King Edward IV. He did not retreat to a command tent to rest. Whenever a section of his line began to buckle under the immense Lancastrian pressure, Edward appeared. He used his massive frame as a human battering ram, throwing himself into the thickest parts of the melee. His presence was a terrifying, irresistible morale booster. You cannot turn and run when your 18-year-old king is standing right beside you, covered in freezing blood, screaming orders and swinging a poleaxe with the energy of a madman. But willpower and a giant king can only sustain a starving army for so long. By late afternoon, the Yorkist forces were reaching their absolute breaking point. The Lancastrians were slowly, methodically pushing them backward down the slope. Every step backward meant giving up the high ground. Edward's all-in gamble was on the verge of total collapse. The Yorkists needed a miracle to survive the fading daylight. Just as the winter sun began to dip below the horizon, the sound of fresh horses and war horns finally echoed from the eastern tree line. By late afternoon, the Yorkist vanguard was practically running on fumes. They were being pushed down the slope, fighting for every inch of blood-soaked snow. Then, just as the winter light began to fail, the entire dynamic of the battle fractured. The Duke of Norfolk finally arrived on the Lancastrian left flank with thousands of fresh Yorkist reinforcements. The psychological impact of fresh troops slamming into an exhausted, freezing army is absolute devastation. Human endurance has a hard ceiling, and the Lancastrians had just hit it. Courage evaporated, instantly replaced by primal mob psychology. When one exhausted man drops his poleaxe and runs, 10 follow him. Within minutes, the disciplined Lancastrian formation disintegrated into a panicked, screaming mob of tens of thousands of men desperate to escape the slaughter. But they had nowhere to run. The geography of the Towton Plateau now became a lethal trap. To the rear of the Lancastrian lines lay a steep drop-off leading down to a waterway known as the River Cock. During the summer you could easily wade across it. On this freezing March evening, however, the heavy winter snowfall and the sudden spring melt had transformed the small beck into a swollen torrential river. The steep, muddy banks were completely stripped of vegetation by the panicked crowd. Thousands of terrified men, weighed down by heavy armour and exhaustion, slid uncontrollably down the slope straight into the icy current. Once you hit freezing water wearing 30 pounds of steel plate and waterlogged wool, physics takes over. You do not swim, you sink. The sheer volume of men pouring into the river created a bottleneck of human flesh. Hundreds drowned in the first few minutes, completely trapped underwater by the weight of their own gear and the frantic men climbing on top of them. The pile of corpses grew so massive that it physically dammed the river, temporarily blocking the freezing water, As military historian A.W. Boardman grimly notes regarding this phase of the massacre, the cock-beck became so choked with the dead and dying that the pursuers crossed over the bodies of the slain as if on a bridge. It is a thoroughly sickening image. Imagine the sheer animalistic terror required to look at a river jammed with the drowning, thrashing bodies of your own comrades and making the conscious decision to step directly onto their heads and backs just to reach the other side. The Yorkist cavalry had broken through by this point. They were riding up and down the banks, mercilessly hacking at the backs of anyone trying to climb out of the water. The chivalric code evaporated entirely on the banks of this river. This was no longer a battle for the crown of England, it was an extermination. The slaughter at the Rivercock was only the beginning of a highly organised political purge. Up until this point in medieval European warfare, captured nobles were practically treated as currency. The chivalric code dictated that you did not slaughter a captured lord. You ransomed him back to his family for a staggering sum of gold. But Edward IV had absolutely no interest in ransom money that day. He understood a ruthless truth about civil wars that his predecessors had ignored. Leaving your wealthy enemies alive only guarantees they will fund another rebellion next spring. Before the vanguard even clashed that morning, the 18-year-old king had issued a chilling directive that fundamentally shattered the rules of medieval combat. Contemporary chronicles confirm his exact cold-blooded command: give no quarter to the lords, but spare the commons. It sounds merciful to the ordinary peasant soldiers at first glance, doesn't it? Do not mistake this for compassion. This was a calculated decapitation strike against the Lancastrian power structure. By ordering the systematic execution of the elite, Edward was permanently destroying the financial and military backbone of the opposition. When the Yorkist cavalry rode down the fleeing Lancastrian army, they weren't just killing indiscriminately, they were actively hunting coats of arms. If you wore the heraldry of a noble house, your surrender was flatly denied. Lords and high-ranking knights who threw down their weapons and offered fortunes in exchange for their lives were dragged into the freezing mud and executed on the spot. Men of immense wealth and political power had their throats cut or their skulls caved in with warhammers while begging for mercy. The sheer scale of this targeted assassination is mind-boggling. Over 40 Lancastrian knights and nobles of high rank were butchered on the field or summarily executed immediately afterward. The Earl of Northumberland, Lord Dacre and Lord Wells were all wiped out. The political landscape of northern England was practically erased in a single afternoon. As the prominent historian Charles Ross succinctly put it, when analysing Edward's tactical ruthlessness, Towton was essentially a graveyard for the northern nobility. I find it fascinating and frankly terrifying how quickly the veneer of honourable knightly combat peels away when absolute power is on the line. Chivalry was a luxury that starving men fighting for their lives could no longer afford. The Yorkists pursued the broken remnants of the royal army for 10 horrifying miles, all the way to the town of Tadcaster. The snowfall finally stopped, but the violence did not. The road north became a continuous, unbroken trail of mutilated corpses. The Wars of the Roses had officially mutated from a political dispute into a war of total annihilation. The sheer logistics of dealing with 28,000 corpses in the 15th century is a nightmare. Few history books bother to explain. When the adrenaline finally faded and the Yorkist army stopped hunting, they were left standing in a sea of mutilated flesh. You cannot simply leave that many bodies to rot, or the resulting plague would kill the victors just as surely as the Lancastrians almost did. But the ground in Yorkshire was still frozen solid. Local peasants were forced at sword point to dig massive industrial-scale trench graves. Before anyone was buried, the bodies were systematically stripped bare. Armour, weapons, boots, and even bloody linen shirts were incredibly valuable commodities. The dead were dumped into the earth naked, packed tightly together in rows to save space. For centuries, these mass graves were nothing more than local legends, until construction workers accidentally unearthed one at Towton Hall in 1996. That discovery completely rewrote our understanding of medieval combat. The forensic evidence extracted from these pits is absolutely chilling. Osteoarchaeologists didn't just find battle wounds, they found evidence of a systematic cold-blooded massacre. The most famous set of remains, known as Towton 25, belonged to a seasoned veteran. His skull reveals a massive bisecting strike from a bladed weapon that sliced completely through the bone, deep into his brain. But that was just one of 8 severe wounds to his head alone. Other skulls showed perfectly square puncture holes, the unmistakable signature of a warhammer's spiked beak being driven directly into the brain case. This wasn't the result of a chaotic frontline clash. The specific placement of these injuries tells a much darker story. Most of the fatal trauma found in the Towton mass graves is concentrated on the back of the skulls and the base of the neck. As researchers from the Towton Battlefield Project documented in their seminal findings, the high frequency of severe sharp force trauma to the posterior cranium indicates these men were struck down from behind while fleeing, or executed while kneeling. Think about the psychological state required to carry out that order. The battle was already over. The Lancastrian soldiers were defeated, disarmed, and terrified. Yet the Yorkist veterans stood over these defenceless men and methodically smashed their skulls in. The frenzy of violence did not stop when the war horn sounded victory. It carried on until the executioners physically could not lift their weapons anymore. The earth of Yorkshire swallowed the evidence of this atrocity for over 500 years. But the bones do not lie. They force us to confront the terrifying reality of what happens when the rules of war are completely abandoned. Nations have a strange habit of curating their own memories. If you ask the average person to name a famous medieval English battle, they will almost certainly say Agincourt or Hastings. We love to celebrate glorious victories against foreign enemies, where a plucky band of brothers overcomes impossible odds. We desperately want to forget the days when we drag our own countrymen into a freezing field and hack them to pieces. That is the true reason Towton remains in the shadows. It is not a story of national triumph. It is a story of profound, unforgivable shame. 28,000 men were slaughtered on that plateau. To understand the gravity of that number, you have to realise it represents roughly 1% of the entire English population at the time. It is a demographic catastrophe that eclipsed the British casualties on the first day of the Somme, compressed into a single afternoon of hand-to-hand combat. Entire villages across the north of England lost every single male of working age. The economic shockwave crippled agricultural production for a generation. And what did this ocean of blood actually buy? Edward IV won his crown, but the throne was poisoned by the very violence he used to secure it. He spent the rest of his reign dealing with endless paranoia, fighting fresh rebellions, and being betrayed by the exact same lords who helped him win at Towton. He died suddenly in his early 40s, leaving his young sons to be infamously murdered in the Tower of London. The Mad King, Henry VI, fared no better. He was eventually captured as a broken fugitive, locked in the tower, and quietly bludgeoned to death while he knelt at his prayers. The brutal reality of the Wars of the Roses is that it was never a romantic conflict of ideals. It was a gang war fought by the poor on behalf of the ultra-rich. The blacksmiths, farmers, and young archers who froze in the blizzard and drowned in the River Cock had absolutely no personal stake in which royal cousin got to wear a heavy gold hat. They were simply the currency spent by ambitious psychopaths. The snow eventually melted in Yorkshire, washing the blood deep into the soil to nourish the spring grass, but the psychological scar left on the kingdom took centuries to heal. When we look at those fractured skulls pulled from the mass graves today, we're not just looking at a medieval anomaly, we're staring into a terrifying mirror. Towton shows us exactly how quickly the rules of civilization evaporate when political tribalism strips away our shared humanity. History is rarely a comfortable place to visit, but we ignore its darkest chapters at our own peril. Thank you for joining me on this descent into England's bloodiest day. If you found this journey as haunting and fascinating as I did, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts on what causes societies to turn on themselves so violently, or what forgotten historical event you want us to uncover next. Until then, keep questioning the past.